She went on a solo hike and got lost in the woods. She found a trench. Inside were camouflaged boxes. When she realized what was inside them, it became clear. This was not meant to be found. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. She had chosen the trail precisely because it promised nothing. No dramatic vistas advertised on laminated signs. No waterfalls with hashtags already attached to their names. No warning labels thick with liability language. Just a thin, pale line on an old forest map, marked as maintained but rarely used, bending through a wide stretch of woodland that most hikers bypassed in favor of something louder and more easily explained to friends afterward. Solitude, for her, was not an escape. It was a calibration. In the hospital, her days were ruled by alarms, by numbers that refused to stay still, by decisions that demanded certainty even when certainty did not exist. Every shift required her to stand between incomplete information and irreversible outcomes, to make peace with the fact that protocol was often a scaffold rather than a solution. The forest offered a different kind of order. Trees did not ask questions. Paths did not demand explanations. If something went wrong, it would do so honestly, without committees or reports. She packed the way she always did, efficiently and without sentiment. The backpack was light but complete. Water, compressed food, layered clothing, a compact shelter she hoped not to use, and an aptechka that looked sparse to most people, but exhaustive to her trained eye. She left behind anything that did not serve a clear function. Experience had taught her that excess weight did not buy safety, only fatigue. She checked the map one last time before starting, tracing the route with a fingertip. The trailhead lay a few miles from the nearest road, accessible but uncelebrated. The plan was simple. Walk in, camp once, loop back out by the second afternoon. She had walked harder routes alone. This one felt almost indulgent. The first hours unfolded exactly as expected. The forest was open, the ground forgiving under her boots. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in wide, unhurried sheets, and the air carried the clean, damp scent of soil and leaves. She walked at a steady pace, attentive but relaxed, letting her breathing find its rhythm. Her thoughts, usually restless, slowed to match her steps. She noticed details without assigning them meaning. The way moss thickened on the north sides of trunks, the soft percussion of birds somewhere above her line of sight. A fallen branch here, an exposed root there. Nothing demanded interpretation. When the signal indicator on her phone dropped to a single bar and then disappeared entirely, she barely registered it. She had expected it. Coverage maps were optimistic by design. She powered the phone down and slid it back into an inner pocket, where it would stay dry and useless until she needed it for something other than reassurance. The trail narrowed gradually, not enough to alarm her, just enough to require attention. Footprints became less frequent, then vanished altogether. The markers she had seen earlier grew farther apart. She slowed, not out of fear, but habit, scanning the ground, the spacing of trees, the slope of the land. The forest felt the same, yet subtly altered, as if a familiar room had been rearranged by someone who understood it better than she did. She stopped once to drink and check the map again. The line beneath her finger still promised direction. According to the scale, she was exactly where she should have been. That was when she made her first mistake. It was not impulsive. It was not careless. It was the kind of decision people like her made every day, the kind that usually saved time and energy. The terrain dipped gently to the east, suggesting a drainage line that would eventually reconnect with the marked trail farther down. Cutting across it would shorten the loop and avoid a section of switchbacks she could already feel in her knees. She stood for a moment, weighing the option, then stepped off the path. At first, the difference was negligible. The forest floor remained consistent, The incline manageable. She kept a rough bearing, adjusting as needed, confident in her ability to read the land. But as she moved farther from the trail, the space began to lose its narrative. Landmarks repeated themselves too cleanly. One stand of trees resembled the last. The light grew flatter, as if depth itself had thinned. She paused again, longer this time, and turned slowly in a full circle. Nothing looked wrong. That, precisely, was the problem. She checked the map, then the compass. Both insisted she was correct. She took another step, then another, and felt the faint, professional tightening in her chest that came not from panic, but from recognition. This was the moment when small errors began to accumulate, when certainty dissolved not in a dramatic collapse, but in quiet subtraction. She adjusted her course slightly, angling downhill as planned. If nothing else, water would reintroduce order. Streams did not lie. They went somewhere. The ground grew damper underfoot. Leaves clung to her boots. The air cooled, carrying a low, continuous sound she hadn't noticed before. At first she thought it was wind moving through the canopy, but the cadence was wrong. Too steady. Too narrow. She stopped. The sound was water, but not the broad, wandering voice of a natural stream. It was quieter, more disciplined, as if it had been instructed where to go. She moved toward it cautiously, parting brush with deliberate care. The slope leveled out, and then she saw it. At a glance, it could have passed for a shallow depression in the forest floor, the kind left by erosion or animal traffic. But as she knelt and brushed aside the top layer of leaves, the geometry revealed itself. The edges were too straight, the width too consistent. Beneath the debris, a narrow channel ran forward with intent, carrying a thin ribbon of clear, cold water. A trench. She straightened slowly, her senses recalibrating. The water moved with just enough speed to remain clean, its surface broken only by small ripples, where it met stones deliberately set along the sides. She followed it with her eyes, noting the gentle, engineered slope. Someone had planned this. Someone had measured. Her gaze dropped to the forest floor beside the trench, and that was when she noticed the line. It was nothing obvious. No disturbed earth, no exposed boards. Just a faint regularity in the way the leaf litter lay, a subtle interruption in the randomness she had come to trust. She crouched again, this time farther from the water, and pulled back a layer of moss. Wood. Just a corner, barely visible, smooth beneath her fingers. She froze, then withdrew her hand, as if from a hot surface. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from awareness. This was not an abandoned tool or a forgotten cache of supplies. The wood was treated, the angle precise. Whatever lay beneath the forest floor had been placed there intentionally and maintained with care. She scanned the area, widening her field of attention. There were no footprints, no paths leading in or out, no signs of a camp. The forest around her stood indifferent and complete, offering no explanation. She did not uncover anything else. Not yet. Instead, she sat back on her heels and listened. The water continued its quiet journey through the trench. The forest breathed around her, unchanged, and beneath the carefully restored skin of leaves and moss, something waited, arranged according to a logic she did not yet understand. She rose slowly, aware that the line she had stepped across was not marked on any map she carried, and that the mistake she had made had not been leaving the trail. It had been assuming the forest was empty. She did not move for a long time after standing up. The discovery had not startled her in the way sudden dangers did. There was no spike of adrenaline, no urge to retreat blindly. Instead, it had slowed her, drawn her inward. Years of clinical work had trained her to respect anomalies that did not announce themselves loudly. The most dangerous deviations were often quiet, easily overlooked if one hurried past them. She forced herself to breathe evenly and shifted her weight, testing the ground before taking a single step. The forest had not changed, and yet it had. Where moments before it had been a continuous field of organic disorder, it now appeared layered, structured in ways she had not previously been looking for. She realized that, until this moment, she had been seeing the woods as scenery. Now she was seeing it as a surface. She moved along the trench first, following the water's path with careful steps. The channel curved gently, never sharply, maintaining a consistency that confirmed her initial impression. This was not erosion. It was guidance. The stones lining the sides were not random either. They had been selected for size and set with intention, small enough to blend, large enough to hold the walls in place. Whoever had built this had understood both water and patience. A few feet away from the trench, the forest floor looked untouched. Leaves lay thick, broken twigs scattered as if by chance, patches of moss rising where moisture lingered. But now that she had seen the corner of wood, she could not unsee the pattern. The ground was too even in places where it should have dipped, too carefully restored, where disturbance would normally leave scars. She crouched again, this time farther down the line, and brushed aside another thin layer of debris. Her fingers met resistance almost immediately. Another edge, another corner, the same wood, the same finish. She straightened and stepped back, widening her view. From above, from a distance, nothing would have drawn the eye. The masking was not designed to defeat scrutiny, only familiarity. Anyone passing through without reason to stop would see nothing more than forest, doing what forests did best, hiding itself. She counted the spaces between the concealed forms, pacing them slowly. Each one lay at a consistent interval, aligned not perfectly parallel to the trench, but close enough to suggest a shared plan. The distances were practical, measured for access rather than aesthetics. She imagined someone kneeling here, lifting sections of cover, working quickly but without urgency, confident that the land itself would erase their presence once they were gone. There were no paths leading in. That absence unsettled her more than footprints would have. Human movement left marks even when people tried not to. Bent grass, compacted soil, broken stems. Here, there was nothing. Either whoever serviced this place was extraordinarily careful, or they approached it from directions she had not yet identified, moving through the forest as something more than a visitor. She resisted the urge to uncover everything at once. That impulse, she knew, came from the same place as panic, even if it wore the mask of curiosity. Instead, she circled the area slowly, mapping it in her mind. The trench, the concealed forms, the surrounding trees. She noted which trunks bore old scars and which did not, which roots broke the surface and which lay hidden beneath. This was not a clearing, it was a node. Her attention returned to the covering itself. The masking was not uniform. In some places, the leaves were layered thickly, suggesting deliberate accumulation. In others, the coverage was lighter, allowing the texture beneath to show through. It was not sloppy. It was adaptive. Whoever had done this had worked with the materials at hand, adjusting to micro-conditions of light, moisture, and decay. This was not camouflage bought from a store and draped carelessly over an object. It was camouflage grown into place. She felt the first true flicker of unease then, not because of what she had found, but because of what it implied. This was not abandoned. Abandoned things decayed unevenly. They surrendered to entropy. Here, entropy had been negotiated with, managed, held at bay. She knelt beside one of the concealed shapes again, this time closer to the trunk of a large fir. The tree's roots wrapped partially around the buried object, stopping just short of touching it. That detail struck her as significant. Roots were relentless. They followed moisture, pressure, space. The fact that they hadn't yet intruded suggested the area had been disturbed relatively recently, or maintained just enough to keep natural processes in check. She pressed her palm flat against the forest floor, feeling for temperature differences. The ground above the concealed object was slightly cooler than the surrounding soil, but not enough to be obvious. If there were contents below that generated heat, they were insulated. If there were contents sensitive to heat, they were protected. Her medical training asserted itself uninvited, cataloging observations, forming hypotheses without yet attaching conclusions. She reminded herself that diagnosis without sufficient data was speculation. Still, she could not deny the accumulating weight of pattern. She rose and took a few steps away, then turned back suddenly, as if to catch the place reacting. It did not. The water flowed. The leaves lay still. The forest offered no acknowledgement of her presence. She realized then how deeply the masking relied on expectation. People did not look for boxes in the ground. They looked for shelters, for smoke, for paths. This place offered none of those. It existed between categories, neither camp nor ruin, neither natural feature nor obvious construction. Her gaze followed the trench again, tracing its direction. It led away from the concealed forms, disappearing into denser undergrowth. She considered following it, then stopped. Whatever lay ahead could wait. The concentration of concealed objects here suggested this was the primary point of interest. Everything else was secondary. She returned to the first corner of wood she had uncovered, studying it more closely. The grain was tight, the surface sealed against moisture. The edge was reinforced with a metal bracket, dull and unmarked, its fastenings recessed. No serial numbers, no manufacturer's mark visible at this angle. She exhaled slowly and made a decision she had been circling since the moment she had touched the wood. She would open one. The choice did not feel reckless. It felt inevitable. Without understanding what lay beneath the masking, she could not assess her own risk, let alone decide what to do next. In medicine, ignorance was sometimes safer emotionally, but never practically. She cleared the covering with deliberate care, setting aside leaves and branches in the order she found them, memorizing their placement. Beneath, the top of a wooden crate emerged, larger than she had expected. The lid was flush, fitted tightly into the frame. 2 metal latches held it closed, both intact, both clean. She did not touch them yet. Instead, she leaned back on her heels and scanned the forest one more time. Still nothing. No sound, but water and distant birds. No sense of being watched, though she knew better than to trust such instincts absolutely. Her hands hovered over the latches. She noted the absence of rust, the faint marks where gloves had gripped them before. This crate had been opened and closed more than once. Recently. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and released the first latch. The sound was soft, almost lost in the ambient noise. The second followed. She lifted the lid just enough to peer inside. What she saw did not match any narrative she had prepared herself for. There were no personal belongings, no food, no tools that spoke of survival or habitation. Instead, the interior was divided into compartments, each holding objects wrapped and sealed with a precision that bordered on ritual. Hard plastic containers, industrial grade, each labeled not with words, but with simple markings, whose meaning she could not immediately decipher. She did not reach in. She did not need to. The sight alone confirmed what the careful masking had already suggested. This place was not meant to sustain life. It was meant to preserve something else. She lowered the lid gently, resecured the latches, and began restoring the covering exactly as she had found it. Leaf by leaf, branch by branch. When she finished, the crate disappeared once more into the forest floor, indistinguishable from its surroundings. Only then did she allow herself to sit back fully, the weight of the discovery settling into her bones. The line she had crossed was no longer hypothetical. It was real, and it ran not just through the forest, but through her understanding of the space she occupied. She had not stumbled upon a forgotten place. She had stumbled upon a working one. She remained where she was for several minutes after resealing the crate, her hands resting loosely on her knees, her gaze unfocused. The forest resumed its ordinary posture with remarkable ease, as if nothing beneath its surface had been disturbed. The water in the trench continued its restrained movement, the sound neither inviting nor threatening. It simply existed. Her first instinct was to leave. That instinct, she recognized, was not fear, but discipline. In the hospital, when something appeared that did not fit the expected clinical picture, the correct response was not curiosity for its own sake, but distance. Step back. Stabilize. Gather more information from a position of safety. But the forest was not a hospital, and she was alone, and the information she lacked was not abstract. It surrounded her, silent and patient. She rose slowly, careful not to rush the motion, and walked a short distance away from the concealed area. She needed space to think, to test whether her thoughts would change once she removed herself from immediate proximity. They did not. The image of the compartmented interior, the sealed containers, the absence of anything that suggested daily life, remained vivid and insistent. This was not a cache meant to support someone hiding in the woods. It was not food, not tools, not shelter. Whatever lay in those crates was not designed to keep a person alive. It was designed to keep something intact. She returned, her movements now deliberate rather than hesitant. If she was going to understand the scope of what she had found, she would need more than a single glimpse. Patterns revealed themselves only through repetition. One crate could be misinterpreted. Several, arranged with consistency, could not. She chose the next crate carefully, selecting one slightly farther from the trench, closer to a cluster of young trees. Again, she cleared the masking with meticulous attention, noting how the covering differed subtly from the first. The branches here were thinner, the leaf layer lighter. Adaptation, not uniformity. The latches were identical. She released them with the same controlled movements and lifted the lid fully this time, bracing it with one hand, while the other hovered just above the contents. The interior mirrored the first crate almost exactly. Compartments of equal size, containers of the same industrial plastic, their surfaces matte, designed to resist reflection. Each was sealed, each marked with the same simple symbols, variations of shape and line that meant nothing to her, yet conveyed order. She reached in now, selecting one container at random. It was heavier than it looked, dense in her hands. She turned it slowly, examining the seams, the seal. No cracks, no sign of compromise. The container was labeled only with a narrow band of color and a small stamped mark that might have been a letter or might have been a number, deliberately ambiguous. She set it back gently and chose another. This one was lighter, its weight distributed differently. When she lifted it, she felt a faint internal shift, as if something inside had moved against restraint. Not loose, but segmented. She did not open any of them yet. Instead, she cataloged. Size, weight, distribution. The containers were not identical, but they belonged to the same system. Each crate held a balanced mix, as if designed to ensure that no single box contained all of one category. Her pulse remained steady, but her thoughts accelerated. The training that allowed her to remain calm in emergency rooms now turned inward, dissecting the scene with professional detachment. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was not panic-driven concealment. It was logistics. She closed the second crate and restored its covering, then moved on to a third, and a fourth. The pattern held. In one container, she finally found something she recognized immediately. The shape alone was enough. She froze with it half lifted from its compartment, her fingers tightening reflexively, before she forced them to relax. A firearm component, not a complete weapon, not even a functional assembly. Just a section, cleanly machined, stripped of any identifying marks. No serial number, no manufacturer's stamp, nothing that could be traced easily, if at all. She lowered it back into place, her breath shallow now despite her efforts to control it. The presence of a single weapon part would have been alarming enough. The implication of many, distributed across multiple crates, was something else entirely. She sat back on her heels, her knees protesting the sustained posture, and looked at the forest around her again. It remained unchanged, indifferent. This place did not broadcast danger. It absorbed it. She continued. In another container, she found bundles wrapped in thick, clear material, compressed so tightly they felt almost rigid. She did not need to count the bills inside to know what they were. Money, stripped of its narrative, reduced to weight and volume. No bands, no markings that suggested a bank or an origin. Just currency, vacuum-sealed and anonymous. In a different compartment, she encountered electronics, small utilitarian devices, their casings unremarkable, their ports covered. Data storage, she realized, memory without context. She stopped there, her hands trembling slightly despite her efforts. The crates were not storing one thing. They were storing pieces of something larger, something fragmented by design. She closed the crate and leaned back against the trunk of a nearby tree, pressing her shoulder blades into the rough bark. The cold seeped through her clothing, grounding her. She needed to think, not as a doctor, not as a hiker, but as someone who had accidentally stepped into a system that did not include her. She had not yet found anything that identified who had built this place, or why. But absence, she knew, could be as telling as presence. There were no personal items, no tools left behind, no signs of improvisation. Everything here had been planned, executed, and maintained with restraint. This was not hoarding. It was staging. The thought settled heavily. Staging implied movement, arrival and departure. It implied that this place was one point along a trajectory, not an end point. Whatever these crates held, they were meant to be here temporarily, protected until some condition was met. She stood and paced slowly, careful to keep her steps light. She tried to imagine the process of servicing this site. Someone approaching without a trail, perhaps from multiple directions to avoid pattern. Someone working quickly but not hurriedly, confident in their schedule. Someone who knew exactly how long the forest would need to heal after each visit. She imagined them kneeling where she knelt, lifting the same latches, replacing containers with precision. No conversation, no hesitation. She realized then that she wasn't meant to be here, not because it was dangerous, but because it was efficient. Her presence introduced unpredictability. Systems like this did not tolerate that for long. She returned to the first crate she had opened and selected one container deliberately this time, choosing one from a central compartment. She carried it a short distance away, just far enough to feel less like she was intruding, and set it down carefully. Her hands hesitated over the seal. In the hospital, opening something without knowing what lay inside was routine. Bodies were opaque until they were not. But this felt different. This was not consented exploration. This was interception. She broke the seal. The container opened with a soft release of pressure, a sound almost intimate in the quiet forest. Inside, nested in fitted foam, lay a series of items arranged with clinical neatness. More firearm components, she saw immediately. though again incomplete. Alongside them, wrapped separately, were smaller objects she recognized from her own professional life. Medical supplies. Not first aid kits. Not the kind of things sold to hikers or campers. These were controlled items, packaged in a way that suggested transport rather than use. Labels had been removed or obscured. Dates were present, but only as codes. Her throat tightened. The convergence of weapons and medical equipment in the same system shifted the meaning of the sight decisively. This was not storage for resale alone. It was preparation. She replaced the items exactly as she had found them, resealed the container, and returned it to its compartment. Her hands moved with mechanical care, driven now by something close to reverence. Not for what lay there, but for the fragile boundary she was crossing. She closed the crate and restored the masking, her fingers memorizing the texture and placement of each element. When she finished, there was no visible sign that anything had been disturbed. She stood, her legs stiff, her mind racing. She now understood enough to be afraid in a precise way. Not of immediate harm, not of an ambush or a trap, but of implication. This place connected to something far larger than itself, and she was now, however briefly, connected to it as well. She looked once more at the trench, at the disciplined flow of water that marked this site as deliberate. The trench was not hiding the crates. It was marking them, quietly, for those who knew how to read it. She turned away then, not to leave entirely, but to create distance. She needed time to decide how much more she could afford to know. Behind her, beneath the careful skin of the forest, the crates waited, indifferent to her presence, patient in their purpose. She did not leave the area, but she stopped touching anything. That decision came to her with the same clarity as a diagnosis finally snapping into place after hours of ambiguity. There was nothing more to be gained from opening containers or lifting lids. The story was no longer inside the crates. It was around them. She moved away from the concealed site in a widening arc, careful to keep the terrain in sight while changing her angle of approach. Distance, even a few dozen yards, altered perspective. The forest resumed its illusion of randomness, but now she could see how carefully that illusion had been preserved. From farther back, the trench no longer read as a channel, but as a suggestion. Its presence was easiest to perceive, not by looking at it directly, but by noticing what the forest did around it. Vegetation grew thicker just beyond its edges, as if encouraged to blur the line. Fallen branches lay across it at irregular intervals, never blocking the water completely, only breaking its outline. Someone had returned here again and again, not to rebuild, but to negotiate with decay. She sat on a fallen log and let the scene settle in her mind. The weight of what she had uncovered pressed on her now, not as fear, but as an intellectual burden. She had enough information to know that this was not an isolated act. It was a node in a larger structure, and structures did not exist without rules. The first rule was invisibility. Nothing here announced itself. No obvious security measures. No fences. No markers. No warning signs. The masking did not say keep out. It said nothing at all. The place relied on being unremarkable, on blending so completely with its surroundings that it escaped not just notice, but curiosity. It was designed for a world where attention was the rarest and most dangerous resource. The second rule was standardization. Every crate she had opened adhered to the same internal logic. Compartments mirrored one another. Containers were sized to fit exactly, neither compressed nor loose. This was not improvisation. This was protocol. Whoever had assembled this cache had not been deciding what to do at each step. They had been following a plan developed elsewhere, perhaps long before the first shovel ever touched soil here. She closed her eyes briefly and let memories surface, unbidden. Over the years, she had absorbed news stories in fragments, the way most people did. Headlines glimpsed while waiting for lab results. Brief reports overheard in hospital lounges. A corruption case dismissed due to procedural inconsistencies. A weapons trafficking investigation that quietly dissolved when key evidence was ruled inadmissible. A federal inquiry that ended not with convictions, but with resignations and silence. At the time, she had not connected these stories. They belonged to different cities, different agencies, different years. But the pattern emerging beneath the forest floor felt familiar in a way that unsettled her. Not because she understood it fully, but because she recognized its shape. This was not the work of criminals operating against the system. This was the work of people who knew the system intimately enough to bend it without breaking it. She considered who could construct something like this. Who would have access to untraceable weapons components, to sealed medical supplies stripped of identifiers, to large sums of currency rendered anonymous by vacuum and time? Who would understand how to hide a cache not from civilians, but from other professionals trained to search? The answer was uncomfortable in its breadth. This could belong to a criminal organization with resources and patience. It could belong to a private contractor operating in the gray zones between legality and necessity. It could belong to a splinter group, a shadow operation justified internally by goals never meant to withstand public scrutiny. Or it could belong to something even more troubling. It could belong to the system itself. The thought did not arrive with drama. It settled slowly, like sediment in water. If the crates held evidence, not just tools, then this wasn't preparation for future action alone. It was containment, control, preservation of items that could not be destroyed outright, but could not be allowed to surface. She imagined an internal debate held far from this forest. Someone arguing that certain materials needed to be secured temporarily. Someone else insisting they could not remain within official channels. A compromise reached, a location chosen not for secrecy alone, but for deniability. The forest would not testify. She felt a tightening in her chest, not fear, but recognition of scale. If this place was what she suspected, then it existed because of a fracture within authority itself. A fault line where accountability became inconvenient. She stood and walked again, tracing the perimeter she now understood better. The spacing between the crates suggested ease of access, not crowding. Each one could be removed independently without disturbing the others. This was not a hoard. It was modular. That detail mattered. Modular systems were built for change. She imagined a team arriving here under cover of routine. No urgency, no panic, just quiet efficiency. They would know exactly which crate to open, which container to remove. They would leave no trace that could not be explained away by time and weather. And if something went wrong, if an audit began somewhere else, this place could be erased in a single visit. Crates removed, trench filled, masking restored. Within weeks, the forest would close over the wound, leaving no scar visible to anyone who did not know where to look. She realized then that she herself was now a variable the system had not accounted for. That was the most dangerous position to occupy. She had not been selected. She had not been vetted. She had not signed anything or agreed to anything. She had simply walked into a space where she did not belong. Systems like this did not plan for randomness. They corrected it. Her thoughts turned inward, pragmatic despite the implications. What had she done that could be traced? She had not taken photographs. She had not used her phone. She had not removed anything. Her only actions were physical, subtle, reversible. Still, she knew enough to understand that knowledge itself was a form of interference. She returned to the edge of the site and stood still, letting the forest resume its dominance. She listened again. not for footsteps or voices, but for absence. The quiet was unbroken. That, too, was telling. If this place were actively monitored in real time, she would already have been interrupted. The system relied not on surveillance, but on obscurity. That gave her time, but not safety. She thought of her own life beyond the trees, her job, her routines, the predictability she had sought by coming here. All of it felt suddenly fragile, as if a thin membrane separated her from consequences she could not fully map. She understood now that the crates were not the story's climax. They were its premise. The true question was not what they contained, but how the world behaved around them. She turned away from the site and walked a short distance, choosing a spot where she could sit without being seen from the crates, yet still return quickly if needed. The decision to stay nearby was not reckless. It was deliberate. She needed to observe, not intervene further, to see whether the system acknowledged disruption. Night was approaching. The light thinned, cooling the colors of the forest. Shadows deepened around the trunks, blurring distances. She prepared a minimal camp without fire, using a natural depression to shield herself from view. Every movement was measured, economical. As darkness settled, her thoughts sharpened rather than dulled. The forest at night was not threatening. It was honest. Sounds traveled differently. Space compressed. She lay awake, listening to the water in the trench, to the subtle shifts of air through branches. No footsteps came. No voices. No sign that anyone else was aware of her presence. And yet she could not escape the certainty that the place itself was aware. Not conscious, not alive, but integrated. This was a location designed to function without supervision, without acknowledgement. A system that assumed compliance from the world around it. She realized then what frightened her most. Not that such a system existed, but that it worked. The forest had accepted it. Time had accepted it. And now, briefly, she had stumbled into its logic. Whether it would accept her remained to be seen. She woke before dawn with the certainty that the night had not belonged to her. Nothing tangible confirmed the feeling. There were no sounds out of place, no footprints near the shallow depression where she had rested, no alteration in the forest's posture. The water in the trench still moved with the same restrained confidence it had the day before, indifferent to light or darkness. Yet the sense of having occupied borrowed space remained, as persistent as a low-grade fever. She lay still for several minutes, eyes open, letting the early gray light define the shapes around her. Habit urged her to inventory herself first. No pain beyond stiffness, no disorientation, no signs of panic. Her body, at least, had accepted the situation with professional calm. It was her mind that resisted stillness, circling the same conclusions without landing on resolution. She rose slowly and packed what little she had disturbed, erasing even the minimal trace of her presence. The discipline came easily. Years of moving through spaces that demanded cleanliness and order had trained her hands to restore rather than alter. When she stood again, the forest offered no sign that she had ever been there. She did not go immediately to the crates. Instead, she walked a widening loop around the site, expanding her understanding of its boundaries. The ground sloped gently in several directions, none of them dramatic enough to draw attention. From certain angles, the trench vanished entirely, its existence betrayed only by the faintest change in vegetation. From others, it became briefly visible, a line of intention cutting through the organic sprawl before dissolving again. She noted how access could be achieved without repetition. A person could approach from the north one day, from the west another, leaving no predictable pattern. The forest here was generous in that way, offering concealment without resistance. She wondered how long it had taken to learn this terrain well enough to exploit it so quietly. As the light strengthened, She returned to the concealed area and stopped just short of touching anything. The decision she had postponed all night pressed forward now, unavoidable. She could leave. That option presented itself with persuasive clarity. She could restore the final traces of disturbance, turn away, and walk until she reached familiar ground. She would emerge with nothing more than an unsettling memory, one she could choose not to revisit. The forest would reclaim the site fully, and whatever processes governed the crates would continue without interference. She could report what she had found. That path was less clear. To whom would she speak? Local authorities would dismiss her, or worse, investigate loudly and incompetently. Federal agencies would require details she could not provide without implicating herself as a witness. Anonymous tips were rarely anonymous to those who understood how systems tracked anomalies. Even a whisper in the wrong channel could mark her as a liability. She could do nothing and tell herself that restraint was wisdom. She closed her eyes briefly and felt the weight of those choices settle into her chest. In her work, she had learned that inaction was still an action, one whose consequences were simply deferred. Patients deteriorated quietly when left untreated. Conditions worsened not because of malevolence, but because of delay. The crates did not feel like a patient. They felt like a diagnosis no one wanted to acknowledge. She opened her eyes and looked again at the arrangement beneath the forest floor. The system was elegant in its restraint. It did not challenge authority openly. It avoided attention not through force, but through humility. It did not proclaim itself righteous or necessary. It simply existed. She understood then that direct confrontation would not disrupt it. It would only provoke correction. If she was going to intervene at all, it would have to be at the level the system itself respected. Subtlety. She moved closer to the crates and knelt beside the one she had opened first. The masking lay as she had restored it, leaves settling naturally into the shapes she had memorized. She removed them again, more quickly this time, her movements efficient but controlled. The lid remained sealed, untouched since the day before. She did not open it. Instead, she examined the ground around it, the precise way the crate had been seated. The edges aligned with a consistency that suggested measurement rather than estimation. Each crate occupied its space exactly, as if part of a larger grid. She stood and stepped back, viewing the arrangement as a whole. The symmetry was not perfect, but it was intentional. Enough order to ensure function, enough irregularity to avoid detection. She selected a single crate, not the first, not the most central, but one offset just enough to register to someone who knew what to look for. She crouched beside it and considered the consequences of what she was about to do. She did not want to damage anything. Damage would trigger response, possibly erasure. She did not want to remove anything. Removal would create a vacuum, an absence too obvious to ignore. She wanted to introduce doubt. With careful precision, she shifted the crate a few inches to the left. The movement was small, almost negligible. The crate remained concealed. The masking still fit. To anyone passing through without knowledge of the original configuration, nothing would appear amiss. But to someone who returned expecting exactness, the discrepancy would stand out immediately. She adjusted the covering, compensating for the shift so that the surface appearance remained unchanged. The leaves settled. The moss pressed down. The forest accepted the alteration without protest. She sat back on her heels and exhaled slowly. This was not sabotage. It was communication. She rose and took several steps away, then returned to the crate once more to ensure the shift was precise. Satisfied, she moved to the trench and followed it for a short distance, making sure that no accidental disturbance had betrayed her presence elsewhere. Everything remained intact. The intervention was complete. She did not linger. Whatever message she had left was not meant for her to witness its reception. The forest would deliver it in its own time. She packed her remaining gear and chose a direction that felt deliberately unremarkable. She avoided the trench, avoided retracing her earlier steps. Instead, she moved diagonally through the trees, allowing the forest to absorb her departure as easily as it had her arrival. As she walked, her thoughts shifted from analysis to consequence. She considered how the system might interpret the discrepancy: a simple error by a team member, a natural shift of soil, or evidence of external interference. If the system was cautious, it would investigate quietly. If it was paranoid, it would cleanse the site entirely. Either outcome would force movement. That was all she had intended. Hours later, she reached terrain she recognized. The forest opened slightly. The ground firmed beneath her boots. When her phone finally regained signal, it did so abruptly, vibrating with delayed notifications that felt absurdly loud after the controlled silence she had left behind. She powered it down again without checking anything. She emerged from the woods by mid-afternoon, her exit as unremarkable as her entry had been. The road appeared without ceremony. Cars passed. People existed. The world had not changed. But she had. As she drove away, she did not look back. There was nothing to see. The forest had already closed over the place she had been, the crates waiting beneath their careful skin, the system adjusting its posture to account for the smallest of disruptions. She did not know whether what she had done would matter. She knew only that doing nothing would have meant accepting a silence she no longer believed in, and that, for her, had never been an option. The transition back into ordinary life did not happen gradually. It arrived all at once, without negotiation, like a door opening onto a brightly lit room after hours spent in half shadow. She stopped at the first town without thinking much about why. It was small, built around a single main road, with a gas station, a diner, and a grocery store that advertised itself with hand-painted signs rather than branding. She parked, went inside, and stood for a moment among shelves of mundane necessities, listening to the hum of refrigeration units and the low murmur of conversation. The normalcy was almost aggressive in its insistence. People debated coffee brands. A child complained about candy. A cashier counted change with bored precision. No one looked at her twice. She paid for a bottle of water she did not need and drank it outside, leaning against her car. The liquid tasted flat, municipal, stripped of any character. It grounded her more effectively than rest would have. She watched traffic pass and waited for her pulse to slow, for the sense of borrowed space to loosen its grip. When she finally drove on, the forest receded behind her as if it had never been there. The road curved, the trees thinned, and the landscape resumed its familiar hierarchy of signs and distances. By the time she reached the highway, the place where she had spent the last day existed only as a set of coordinates in her mind, unrecorded and deliberately so. She returned to work 2 days later. The hospital welcomed her back without ceremony. Charts awaited review. Patients needed reassurances that could be offered without certainty. Machines beeped in patterns she understood. The competence required of her was immediate and absolute, leaving little room for reflection during the day. That, she discovered, was both a relief and a challenge. In the quiet moments between tasks, the forest returned to her. Not as an image, but as a structure. She caught herself mapping systems she encountered onto the one she had left behind. Supply chains, redundancies, fail-safes. In meetings, she listened more closely than usual when administrators spoke about audits and internal reviews. Words like discrepancy and compliance acquired new resonance. She did not speak of what she had found, not to colleagues, not to friends, not even to herself in the form of written notes. Memory, she knew, could be safer than documentation. The fewer artifacts that existed outside her mind, the better. Weeks passed. Nothing happened, which she had expected and did not trust. The first indication that her intervention had registered came quietly, through a channel so indirect it could easily have been dismissed as coincidence. She was scrolling through a newsfeed one evening, half attentive, when a brief item caught her eye. An internal review had been announced within a federal agency, the specifics withheld. The scope described only as procedural irregularities related to evidence handling. No names, no locations, no outcomes. She read the article twice, then closed it without bookmarking or sharing. It could have meant nothing. It could have referred to any number of cases, any number of failures. But the phrasing lingered. Procedural irregularities was language designed to acknowledge disruption without assigning blame. It was language that signaled inward correction rather than public reckoning. More notices followed over the next months, each as restrained as the last. A reassignment here, a resignation there, attributed to personal reasons. A case reopened and then quietly resolved without trial. The pattern was diffuse, deliberately so, but she recognized its rhythm. The system was moving. She did not feel vindicated. There was no satisfaction to be found in this kind of confirmation. If anything, the absence of spectacle underscored how insulated the process was from the world she inhabited daily. Whatever adjustments were being made would not be announced, debated, or explained. They would simply occur, absorbed into institutional memory, and then forgotten. She continued her work. Life continued. It was nearly a year later when she returned to the forest. The decision did not come with urgency. It emerged slowly, as if the idea had been waiting for permission. She did not frame the trip as a test or a confrontation. She told herself honestly that she needed closure, though she suspected that word was inadequate. She planned the visit with the same care she had given the first, but this time she knew the terrain more intimately. She chose a different season, a different approach. The forest greeted her with the same indifference it had before, unchanged by her absence or her thoughts. When she reached the area where the trench had been, she stopped. The water was gone. The channel remained, but it was filled now, not crudely, but with intention. Soil had been returned, packed down carefully, seeded with debris consistent with its surroundings. To an untrained eye, it might have appeared as nothing more than a natural depression slowly healing. To her, it was unmistakable. She moved closer, heart steady, breath controlled. There were no crates. The forest floor where they had been concealed was smooth, almost too smooth, the masking reestablished with professional thoroughness. New growth had begun, encouraged rather than left to chance. Saplings had been planted at irregular intervals, their roots already anchoring the disturbed earth. The grid she had once perceived was gone, replaced by deliberate randomness. She walked the perimeter slowly, confirming what she already knew. The site had not been abandoned in haste. It had been dismantled. The efficiency of the removal unsettled her more than the presence of the crates ever had. Nothing had been left behind. No broken latch. No stray fragment. The system had closed itself with the same discretion it had used to exist. She crouched and pressed her palm to the ground, where she had shifted the crate. The soil felt compact and cool, alive with the slow work of insects and roots. Whatever message she had sent had been received. As she stood, something caught her eye. It was small, easily overlooked, half hidden beneath a layer of leaves near the base of a tree she did not remember distinctly. She hesitated, then knelt and brushed the debris aside. The object rested there without concealment, yet without announcement. A piece of metal, dull with use, shaped in a way that would mean nothing to most people. To her, it was immediately recognizable. A medical hemostat. An older model, no longer standard issue. its locking mechanism worn smooth by repeated sterilization and use. It was clean, but not polished. Functional, not symbolic. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. The message was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was not gratitude. It was recognition. Someone involved in dismantling the site had known enough to choose this object deliberately. They had understood her background, or at least inferred it. They had left the hemostat not as evidence, but as a boundary. We know who you are. We see what you did. And we are choosing not to pursue it. She closed her hand around the metal briefly, then set it back where she had found it, returning the leaves to their place. Taking it would have been a mistake. Possession created obligations she did not want. She stood and looked around one last time. The forest had reclaimed its authority completely. There was nothing here now to distinguish this place from any other stretch of woodland. That was the final proof of the system's success. As she turned to leave, she understood something with a clarity that surprised her. Truth in the world she inhabited did not always need exposure to exert force. Sometimes it only needed to be redistributed, shifted just enough to alter trajectories invisible to those not watching closely. She walked away without looking back, her steps unhurried, her thoughts steady. The forest closed behind her, not as a guardian or a judge, but as it always had been, an accomplice to silence, and therefore to survival. She returned to her life carrying no documents, no proof, no story she could tell. Only the knowledge that for a brief moment she had stood at the edge of a system that preferred not to be seen and had touched it just enough to make it move. If this story held your attention, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. More stories like this are already waiting for you here. Share this video with someone who appreciates thoughtful, realistic storytelling.